The snow was falling in slow, heavy flakes, soft enough to make the town look peaceful if Sarah hadn't known better. She pulled her shawl tighter, her gloved hands trembling as she adjusted the basket on her arm. Inside lay a loaf of bread and a small sack of flour, meager supplies for the journey home, but she'd learned to make do since James had been gunned down. Every step toward the edge of town tightened the knot in her stomach. She could feel eyes on her even before she reached the last building. The men who had killed her husband weren't hiding their intent anymore. They lounged against a fence post near the blacksmith's, watching her the way coyotes watch a wounded doe. She kept her head down, her boots crunching in the snow, willing her heart to stay steady. If she could just get to the ridge trail before they moved, she might make it home before dark. But as she passed the livery, one of them called out something crude, the sound slithering down her spine. She didn't look back. Then, from the far edge of town, movement caught her eye. A tall figure stepping from between two cottonwoods, his long, dark hair brushing the shoulders of a weathered buckskin coat. His steps were slow but purposeful, each one sinking deep into the snow. Even at a distance, she recognized him. Chaitton. She hadn't seen him since her father's burial, but she remembered the way he'd stood apart from the other mourners, head bowed, saying nothing. He was a Lakota warrior, a man her father had once risked his life to save during a skirmish in the Dakota Territory years before she was born. She hadn't known much about him, only that he'd vanished into the wild soon after, leaving no word. Now he was here, walking toward her like the snow itself had carried him. The men by the fence straightened, their eyes narrowing. Chaitton's gaze passed over them without pause, settling on her with a calm that seemed to steady the ground beneath her feet. When he reached her, he didn't greet her the way most men would. He simply looked at her basket, then at the road ahead, and said, low and certain, "I'll walk you home." The words were not a question, and before she could protest, he stepped to her side, matching her stride. The men didn't move, but their eyes followed, their smirks curling into something darker. Somewhere beyond the falling snow, Sarah knew they were already planning where they'd make their move. They left the last of the buildings behind, the wind cutting sharper without the shelter of town walls. Sarah could hear the steady crunch of Chaitton's boots beside hers, unhurried yet deliberate, as if he knew exactly how far behind the men would follow. She risked a glance over her shoulder. 3 of them now, James Avery's killers, trudging after them at a measured pace, their hats pulled low against the snow. Her pulse kicked harder. "You don't have to do this," she murmured, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "They're after me, not you." Chaitton didn't answer right away. He scanned the tree line, the distant rise of the ridge, and the darkening sky beyond. "Your father carried me on his horse 3 days with a bullet in my side," he said finally, his voice quiet but edged with memory. "He gave me water when he had none left for himself. He told me, 'A debt like that never dies.'" Sarah swallowed hard. Her father had spoken of a young warrior he'd met in his ranger days, but never in detail. She'd thought it just another one of his frontier stories. "That was a long time ago," she said, her breath turning white in the cold. "And my father's gone." Chaitton's eyes shifted to hers, and for a moment she saw the weight behind them, years of loss, promises kept in silence. "But you are not," he said. The wind picked up, sweeping snow in long, whispering swirls across the ground. Somewhere behind them came the faint snap of a twig. Chaitton's head tilted slightly, his hand brushing the edge of the hunting knife at his belt. "They'll wait until the bend in the ridge," he murmured, almost to himself. "Too narrow there for you to run." Sarah's stomach knotted. The bend was still half a mile ahead, a narrow cut through red sandstone where the trail dropped sharply toward the river. Once inside, they'd be boxed in. She thought of turning back, of ducking into one of the side trails through the pines, but Chaitton shook his head before she could speak. "They expect fear," he said. "We give them something else." His calm was unsettling, like he'd been here before, walking someone toward danger instead of away from it. Snow settled on his shoulders and dark hair, and still he walked as though he carried the warmth of another season inside him. Behind them, the men were closing the gap. One laughed, the sound ugly and sharp against the wind. Chaitton glanced at Sarah's basket, then at the sky, and said in a tone so even it sent a shiver down her spine, "When we reach the bend, you'll keep walking, no matter what you hear." The sandstone walls rose on either side, their red faces dusted white with fresh snow. The path here was narrow, barely wide enough for two people to walk shoulder to shoulder, and Sarah's breath quickened as the shadows deepened. The sound of the men's boots grew louder behind them, crunching through the packed snow with the slow certainty of hunters closing in on prey. Chaitton's stride never faltered. His eyes swept the ridge ahead, noting the way the wind had drifted snow against one side of the trail, leaving the other bare and slick. He leaned slightly toward Sarah. "Stay left. Don't stop." She tightened her grip on the basket, the loaf of bread suddenly feeling like an anchor in her arms. She tried to match his pace, but her boots slipped once on the icy rock, and his hand shot out to steady her. His touch was brief, warm despite the cold, and gone before she could thank him. The first man's voice echoed down the sandstone walls. "Long way home, Mrs. Avery. Why not stop and talk a while?" Laughter followed, bouncing off the narrow walls, and Sarah's chest tightened. She didn't answer. Chaitton slowed, just enough to let the gap between him and Sarah widen by a single pace. It was a subtle shift, but it put him directly between her and the men when they rounded the bend. Sarah could hear them now, closer than before, their boots scuffing against the rock. She risked a glance back and caught sight of their faces. Grins stretched too wide, eyes glittering with malice. Then one of them stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. "You don't belong here, Indian," he called, his voice dripping with contempt. "Why don't you take your squaw-loving hide back to the hills before you get hurt?" Chaitton stopped walking. Slowly, he turned to face them, his shoulders squared and his gaze steady. The wind tugged at the fringe of his coat, but he stood as if the cold and the insults meant nothing. "Go," he said, his voice low but carrying. "While you still can." The man in front laughed, drawing his revolver an inch from the holster. "Or what?" For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Chaitton's hand blurred to his belt, and the glint of steel flashed in the dim light. The knife was in his hand, its edge catching the faint glow of snow-reflected sun, before Sarah even realized he'd moved. Her heart pounded in her ears. "Walk," he murmured to her, not looking back, and with her knees trembling she obeyed, each step carrying her deeper into the narrow pass, her ears straining for the sound of what would happen next. Sarah's steps quickened, her breath coming in ragged bursts as she moved deeper into the bend. The walls on either side seemed to press closer, and every instinct screamed at her to look back. But she remembered Chaitton's words, "No matter what you hear," and forced her eyes forward. The wind whistled through the gap, carrying with it the sudden crack of a gunshot. She flinched, nearly stumbling, but the shot was followed not by another, but by a sharp grunt and the scuffle of boots on rock. Then came the sound of steel striking flesh, a sound she had never heard before but would never forget. Voices rose in anger and pain. "He cut me!" one shouted, panic edging his tone. Another barked something Sarah couldn't make out before the wind tore the words away. A second shot rang out, closer this time, and she froze, until a figure moved past her left side, quick as a shadow. Chaitton. His knife was slick with red, his coat darkened by spattered blood. His chest rose and fell steadily, though his eyes were sharp, scanning the ridge ahead. "Keep going," he said, not slowing. "Two are down, one's running ahead to cut us off." Sarah's stomach lurched. "Cut us off?" He nodded toward the far curve of the ridge. "Trail forks there. He knows the shortcut through the pines." She wanted to tell him to turn back, to leave her and save himself, but the words caught in her throat. She knew he wouldn't. They pushed on, the snow underfoot squealing with each step. The sandstone walls began to fall away, replaced by thick pines crowding the trail. Chaitton's pace quickened, and Sarah followed, her legs burning with the effort. They broke into a small clearing just as the third man emerged from the trees ahead, his revolver already raised. "End of the trail," he sneered, breath steaming in the cold. Chaitton didn't stop moving. His voice was calm, almost soft. "Put it down." The man laughed. "Not a chance." For a moment, the world narrowed to 3 figures in the snow. The gunman, the woman clutching a basket, and the warrior moving toward him with the steady, inevitable stride of a predator closing on prey. Then the gun went off. Snow exploded near Sarah's boots, the heat of the bullet's passage brushing her leg. She gasped, stumbling back. Chaitton lunged, his knife flashing upward in a brutal, fluid arc. The gunman cried out, dropping his weapon as he fell to his knees, clutching his arm. Chaitton kicked the revolver into the snow and turned to Sarah, his voice low but urgent. "We keep moving. They'll have friends." The moment they crossed into the trees, the world changed. The wind died, muffled by the thick canopy, and the air turned heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Snow clung to the branches above, falling in soft clumps with every gust that rattled the forest. Sarah's boots sank into the softer ground here, the crunch of snow replaced by the dull thud of frozen needles. Chaitton moved ahead of her now, his knife still in hand, eyes darting to every shadow. "They'll try to circle us," he murmured. "The forest belongs to them more than the town does." Sarah gripped the basket tighter, her fingers aching from the cold. "Why are they doing this?" she asked, her voice low. Chaitton didn't look back. "Because you saw them kill your husband. Because you lived." His words landed heavy in her chest. She had spent weeks trying not to think about that night, pushing away the image of James falling in the snow, his blood pooling black in the moonlight. But here, in the quiet of the pines, it returned sharper than ever. The forest grew darker, the trail narrowing to a deer path winding between fallen logs and rocks. Somewhere to their right, a branch snapped. Chaitton froze, raising a hand for her to stop. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was listening, waiting. Then came the faint crunch of footsteps, deliberate and slow, moving parallel to them. "One," Chaitton whispered. "Maybe 2. He motioned for her to move forward, then slipped off the trail to the right, vanishing into the undergrowth without a sound. Sarah's heart pounded. She wanted to call after him, to tell him not to leave her, but before she could, a figure stepped onto the path ahead. It wasn't Chaitton. The man's face was pale against his dark coat, his eyes locked on her with cold intent. "You're a long way from town, Mrs. Avery," he said, stepping closer. "Hand over the basket." Sarah backed away, her boots slipping on the frozen ground. Her mind raced. Bread and flour weren't worth killing for, so why? Then another voice came from behind her, low and cruel. Forget the basket. She's the payment." Her breath caught. A shadow moved at the corner of her vision, and before either man could take another step, Chaitton emerged from the brush like a wraith, his knife pressed to the nearer man's throat. "No," he said, his voice deep and steady. "The debt is mine to settle." The man froze under the blade, his breath quickening, eyes darting to the companion standing a few paces behind Sarah. That second man's hand hovered over the revolver at his hip, but something in Chaitton's stillness, an unspoken promise of swift violence, kept him from drawing. "Drop it," Chaitton said, his voice low enough that the words barely stirred the cold air. The revolver clattered into the snow. Chaitton pushed the knife a fraction closer to the man's throat before shoving him toward a pine trunk. "On your knees," he ordered. The man obeyed. Sarah's pulse was still thundering in her ears, her hands stiff from gripping the basket so hard. She wanted to run, but her legs felt rooted to the forest floor. The second man shifted, testing the air, and Chaitton's gaze snapped to him. "Leave," Chaitton said, his tone flat. "Now." There was a pause, a tense few seconds where Sarah thought he might fight, but instead the man backed away, melting into the trees until only the faint crackle of branches marked his retreat. Chaitton kept the first man under the knife for another moment before stepping back. "Go," he said simply. The man didn't need telling twice. He scrambled up and bolted into the forest. Only when the sound of his fleeing steps faded did Chaitton lower his weapon. Sarah finally found her voice. "You could have killed them." Chaitton's eyes held hers, unreadable. "And made more enemies than we already have?" He cleaned the blade on a strip of cloth from his coat, sliding it back into its sheath. Then he looked past her, toward the narrow sliver of trail disappearing into the dark pines. "We keep moving. There's a place ahead." Sarah fell into step beside him, though she could feel her body trembling from the close call. "Why do this for me?" she asked after a long stretch of silence. "You barely knew my father." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then, without looking at her, he spoke. "Years ago, your father rode into a valley where I was bleeding in the dirt. My own people had turned from me, and the men chasing me wanted my scalp for coin. He didn't ask my name, didn't ask why. He just pulled me onto his horse and rode 3 days without stopping." His voice was steady, but there was a depth to it that made Sarah's throat ache. When a man does that, you carry his shadow the rest of your life. And when his daughter's in trouble, you don't walk away. The forest seemed to thicken the farther they went, the pines leaning in overhead until the daylight was reduced to a pale wash between branches. Sarah followed Chaitton in silence, her legs heavy, her breath frosting the air in shallow bursts. The snow underfoot grew crusty and uneven, hiding roots that threatened to trip her at every step. Just when she began to wonder if they were lost, the trees opened to reveal a small clearing. In the center stood a cabin, low-roofed, built from dark, weathered logs, its chimney sending up a faint ribbon of smoke. It looked abandoned at first, but the faint glow of an oil lamp flickered in the lone window. Chaitton raised a hand for her to stay back, then moved forward with the silent caution of a predator. He pushed the door open without knocking. Inside, the warmth of a fire hit Sarah like a wave, and the sharp scent of pine sap mixed with something meatier. Venison stew, she guessed. The cabin was sparsely furnished, a cot in the corner, a table scarred with knife marks, and along one wall a rack of bows, rifles, and traps. It was clearly the home of someone who lived far from town and wanted it that way. "Friend of yours?" Sarah asked softly. Chaitton shook his head. "Used to be. He's gone now." He shut the door behind them and set her basket on the table. "We won't stay long. Just enough to get warm and eat." Sarah's gaze drifted to the weapons. Was he like you? Chaitton glanced at her, a faint, wry curve at the corner of his mouth. No one's like me. She wanted to ask what he meant, but before she could, the wind outside shifted. A faint crunch in the snow reached her ears, too deliberate to be falling branches. Chaitton heard it too. His hand went to the rifle leaning against the wall. They found us, he murmured. He moved to the window and parted the curtain just enough to see outside. Sarah's breath caught when she followed his gaze. Shapes moved between the trees. 3, maybe 4 men, their outlines dark against the snow. One carried a lantern, its light casting wild shadows that danced across the trunks. They're not done with us, Chaitton said. His tone was calm, but the way he checked the rifle's chamber told Sarah exactly how serious it was. He turned from the window, his eyes locking on hers. When I tell you, you take the back door and run for the ridge. Don't look back. Sarah's stomach knotted as Chaitton moved with deliberate efficiency, setting a small pouch of cartridges on the table and loading the rifle with the steady rhythm of a man who had done it 100 times. The crackle of the fire seemed too loud now, masking the faint sounds of movement outside. Snow crunching, branches shifting, the low murmur of men deciding how best to corner their prey. They'll come from both sides, Chaitton said quietly, his eyes never leaving the doorway. One will draw my attention at the front, the others will take you from behind. He crossed to the back door and checked the latch, then turned to her. You hear me fire twice, you run. No hesitation. Sarah's heart pounded. And if you don't fire twice? His jaw tightened. Then you still run. Outside, the wind gusted, carrying with it a voice from the dark. Avery, we know you're in there. Hand over the woman and we'll let you live. Sarah's grip tightened on the basket handle, though she didn't know why she still held it. It felt like the only thing tethering her to something normal. Chaitton stepped to the front window, resting the rifle barrel just beneath the sill. They're closer than they sound, he muttered. The lantern light moved between the trees, a slow, circling predator's glow. Another voice joined the first. Closer now. You got no business in this, Injun. Walk away. Chaitton's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. Without a word, he squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, and the lantern-bearer spun to the ground with a cry, the light tumbling into the snow and dying in a hiss of steam. Shouts erupted. Snow sprayed against the cabin wall as a bullet slammed into the logs. Chaitton ducked back, yanking the curtain closed. They'll rush us now, he said, already moving to the back door. He handed Sarah a folded wool coat. Put this on. It'll keep you from freezing when you run. She slipped into it with trembling hands. The front door shuddered under a heavy blow, then another. Chaitton moved to meet it, knife now in his other hand, his body coiled like a spring. He glanced over his shoulder just once. Remember, 2 shots. The door splintered inward, and the first man through met Chaitton's blade before he could fire. Sarah's breath caught as the rifle roared again, echoing off the cabin walls. That was 1 shot. She braced, waiting for the second, but before it came, the back window shattered, and cold air rushed in with the sound of boots hitting the floor. The man who came through the window was fast, faster than Sarah expected, but desperation sharpened her senses. She swung the basket with all her strength, the edge catching him across the temple. He stumbled, cursing, and she didn't wait to see if he'd recover. The second rifle shot split the air from the front of the cabin, and Chaitton's command echoed in her mind. Run. She yanked open the back door, icy wind knifing into her lungs as she bolted into the night. The snow was deeper here, forcing her legs to burn with each step as she pushed toward the ridge. Behind her, shouts tangled with gunfire, the chaos spurring her forward. The moonlight turned the snow into a pale, glowing path, but the forest beyond was black and shifting. Every crack of a branch made her imagine they were right behind her. She dared one glance back and caught sight of a figure breaking from the cabin's rear. Not Chaitton. His dark silhouette moved low and quick, cutting the distance between them. Sarah's breath came ragged now, the cold biting at her throat. She veered off the main slope, plunging into a narrow gully where the snow was shallower and the shadows thicker. Her boots slipped on ice hidden beneath the powder, but she stayed upright, driven by something more primal than fear. She didn't know how far she'd gone when the sound of pursuit faded, replaced by the faint gurgle of running water. The gully opened to a frozen creek, its surface fractured where the current pushed beneath thin ice. She hesitated, remembering the stories James used to tell about people breaking through and vanishing under the sheet. The decision was made for her when the crunch of snow returned. Closer this time. Without thinking, she crouched low and scrambled beneath an overhanging bank where roots jutted like black claws. Snow and earth clung to her coat as she pressed herself flat, her breath loud in her ears. The man appeared moments later, a shadow against the silvered snow, his head turning side to side. He passed so close she could see the steam of his breath drifting in the cold. For a heartbeat, she thought he might hear the pounding in her chest. Then, as quickly as he'd come, he moved on, his steps fading into the distance. Sarah stayed still until her muscles screamed, then slowly crawled out, scanning the dark. No sign of him. She turned upstream, away from the cabin, praying Chaitton was still alive to find her before the others did. Sarah followed the frozen creek until her legs felt carved from stone, each step heavier than the last. The world was silent, but for the groan of ice shifting under the current and the whisper of wind moving through the trees. She had no sense of time, only the gnawing fear that every minute Chaitton might be falling under the weight of too many enemies. When she rounded a bend, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead. For an instant, her body locked in terror. Then the familiar breadth of his shoulders and the deliberate calm in his stride told her it was him. Chaitton's coat was torn at the sleeve, and a line of blood ran from his temple, but his rifle was still in his hand. Relief flooded her so fast it made her knees weaken. "You're alive," she whispered. He gave a small nod, scanning the trees behind her before motioning her forward. "They won't follow us now." His tone was certain, but there was a heaviness in it. "Are they?" she began. He cut her off gently. "Gone." Whether that meant dead or scattered, she didn't ask. They climbed away from the creek, cresting the ridge just as the first pale light of dawn bled into the sky. Below, smoke from the cabin curled lazily upward, fainter now, almost a memory. At the top, Sarah paused, breathless, looking out over the endless stretch of snowbound forest. "If you hadn't come," her voice broke. Chaitton shifted his rifle to his shoulder, studying her for a long moment. "Your father saved my life when I didn't think it was worth saving," he said. "I gave him my word that if he ever needed me, I'd come. I wasn't there for him when it mattered, but I could be here for you." Sarah blinked hard against the sting in her eyes. "Then you've kept your promise." He shook his head slightly. "Number, I'm keeping it still." They started down the other side of the ridge, where the land dipped into a narrow valley. Nestled at its base was a small cabin, smoke rising from its chimney, a curl of warmth in the frozen wilderness. "A friend," Chaitton said simply. "Someone who owes me a debt." For the first time in days, Sarah felt the weight in her chest loosen. She glanced back once toward where the danger had been, then faced forward, matching her steps to his. Whatever lay ahead, she knew one thing with certainty. The man who had appeared out of the trees with her baby's blanket was not just her father's friend. He was her shield, her guide, and the reason she was still walking into the dawn.